Hey Warriors, this video is for U.S. history, and this is regarding the material found on page 49 about law and order presidents. And if you look at that page, it says that from the late 60s on in this country, a lot of presidential candidates have used this kind of language around law and order, maintaining law, maintaining order in society, keeping everyone safe, to try to appeal to people that they are the kind of strong and tough person that we would want to be a president, to be able to make our society safe. And so I want to talk about a few of these people and what their presidential administrations were like. Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, took office in 1969. He resigned in 1973 because he was more than likely about to be impeached as a result of the Watergate scandal. That's a completely different story. But we want to talk about Nixon and his law and order kind of language. When he was running for president in 1968, he kept kind of hammering this theme that the country was full of people that were discontented and they were causing problems and causing violence, and he traced some of those things to drugs and the crime that results often from drugs being prominent in communities. And so he becomes president. He kind of declares a war on drugs. And in retrospect, looking back, you can see that this was all sort of preparation for Nixon and the Nixon administration to behave very aggressively toward elements of society that didn't agree with them. And we talked about the decades of the 60s and 70s and how these countercultural groups were demonstrating against the government, against the government's policies and the government's actions. And so look into this a little bit on your own. Anybody who was speaking out against the status quo, or the way things have kind of always been up to that point, became a target for the Nixon administration and for the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover at the time. And the way that the FBI and law enforcement, federal law enforcement and state law enforcement agencies began to deal with these countercultural groups became more and more aggressive and violent. Look at, for instance, you can look this up. Look at the killing of the members of the Black Panther Party in the late 60s, for instance. You could look at specifically the case of Fred Hampton, who was killed in Chicago in 1969. Read about this raid conducted by law enforcement. He and one other man were essentially shot in their sleep in their apartment. Very aggressive kind of policies toward groups and individuals that didn't agree with the government. Let's jump forward to 1970. Now, at Kent State University in Ohio, 4 young college students were killed by National Guardsmen on the 4th day of what had been 4 days of protest, anti-war protest against our involvement in Vietnam in general, and specifically our attack on Cambodia, which was neutral at the time in the war. And so the response to those anti-war protesters became ultimately aggressive and violent, and 4 people were shot and killed. 9 other people were injured in that event on May 4th, 1970. So this war on drugs, one member of the administration, of the Nixon administration, later admitted that this was a way for them to kind of silence some of these other groups. And so this is a quote that came out in 2015, 2016 from John Ehrlichman. And he was Richard Nixon's domestic affairs advisor. And he says this is an exact quote: "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the Vietnam War or to be black. But by getting the people to associate the hippies most of the hippies were anti-war at that time. To associate the hippies with marijuana and black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both very heavily, criminalizing marijuana, criminalizing heroin, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, we could raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news, meaning put coverage on the evening news that made them continually look bad and dangerous and a detriment to American society. Did we know, Ehrlichman says, we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So this is the impact of one law and order candidate, Richard Nixon, on the nation and on people's personal freedoms. The next president I'd like to talk about is Ronald Reagan. He was elected in 1980 and served 2 terms from 1980 to 1988. And he I think in many ways got his start in politics when he was involved in the McCarthy hearings in the 50s during the Red Scare. And he was called to testify. He was not one of those people who refused to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee. He was one who gladly cooperated and who cooperated with them, giving them other people's names and things like that. So this sort of put him in the political arena back in the 50s. Now in the 1960s, he is running all of a sudden as governor for the state of California as a Republican. And he says in a pretty well-known speech called A Time for Choosing in 1964, the Founding Fathers knew a government can't control the economy without controlling people. And so here we see some language that suggests that you have to control the people if you want to control the economy. And you can look into the Reagan administration, look at trickle-down economics that are sometimes referred to as Reaganomics. But you can also look through the 80s at the rise in the use, the dispersion and use of crack cocaine. And this was used in much the same way as marijuana and heroin being criminalized heavily in the Nixon administration. The kind of separate rules and punishments for crack cocaine as opposed to powder cocaine gives us some insight into the way that particular people were persecuted during the Reagan administration. And here again, you have a president kind of conducting this war on drugs. Lots and lots of people in the 1980s are doing cocaine, okay? Not a good thing to do, but a lot of people were doing it anyway. And powder cocaine was sort of understood to be a white person's cocaine that was more expensive, and crack cocaine or rock cocaine was less expensive and was dealt primarily in poorer neighborhoods. And we know that a lot of those poorer neighborhoods happen to be communities of color. And so the way that a person would be punished if they were convicted of possessing crack cocaine as opposed to powder cocaine was very different. It was dramatically different. And so this turned out to be a way to really heavily persecute and incarcerate large numbers of young black men during the Reagan administration. And so this is a result of a law and order candidate and their policies. I'm going to put a link in the description below to a TED Talk given by the author of a book called The New Jim Crow. Michelle Alexander is her name. And if you want to watch that TED Talk, she talks about this, about how people in leadership kind of strategically pulled the rug out from under communities of color during this time. Is Bill Clinton, and how he was sort of a law and order candidate. He was a Democrat. The other two, Nixon and Reagan, were Republicans. Clinton was a Democrat. He was a centrist, meaning that if you think about Democrats as being on the left end of the spectrum and Republicans being on the right end of the spectrum, he was in the middle. So he was a Democrat and appealed to a lot of Democrats, but he was close enough to the middle line where Republicans started to kind of live and think that he appealed to some Republicans too. And part of the way that he did that was to employ the same kind of language that he intended on kind of cleaning up society and being tough on crime. And so in 1994, one of the most significant things that happened from 92 to 2000 when Clinton was in office was the passage of what's sometimes referred to as the Clinton Crime Bill. It was actually called the Omnibus Crime Bill. And what this did was to lengthen mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for crimes so that judges would have, they have to sentence, if a person's convicted of a crime, the judges have to sentence according to certain guidelines. Well, the mandatory minimums, the smallest amount of time that they could assign to a person who was convicted of a crime, those were going up. They were getting longer in duration. So those mandatory minimums went up. Also, there were restrictions in this bill that said you had to serve a longer portion of your sentence than you ever had to before. Usually about 85 to 90% of your sentence had to be served. There were also other provisions in this bill, the three strikes bill, or the three strikes rule, meaning if you were convicted of 3 felonies, typically violent felonies, but there were windows opened in this policy for felony drug convictions as well, that on that third conviction, you would be in prison for the rest of your life. So this kind of tightening of the screws on the criminal justice system and how it behaved toward convicted criminals, that takes the work that the Nixon administration and the Reagan administration had done and then makes it even worse, particularly often for communities of color who were targeted disproportionately, often unfairly, by law enforcement on the federal and state and local levels. And so this is what those law and order candidates began to do, and we continue to feel the impact of this in our society today in the uneven way in which policing often happens in our communities. Donald Trump, by the way, our current president, candidated, or he campaigned on that idea that he was a law and order candidate too, that he was going to clean up the country and get rid of all the criminals. And so we see these kinds of things being played out again now, and you know, if you're paying attention, what's happened during the Trump administration so far. So that's a wrap up to this class. Again, I'm going to leave a link to the Michelle Alexander TED Talk. I'd like you to listen to that. But take a few notes about these 3 presidential candidates and think about the impact that from the middle 60s onward they had on our country and on our communities. That's it for this time.